only imagine.
Our second scripture reading this morning is also from the book of 1 Thessalonians, chapter 4, verses 9 to 12. We're reading from the ESV. It might be a little bit different from the words on the screen. Now concerning brotherly love, you have no need for anyone to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. For that indeed is what you are doing to all the brothers throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, brothers, to do this more and more, and to aspire to live quietly, and to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands, as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders, and be dependent on no one. This is the word of the Lord. Let us pray. Gracious God, we give thanks for the message that you've prepared this morning. Spirit, we ask that you would be with me as I speak and be in the hearts of those who hear, to your good will and your good purpose. Amen. Well, good morning. As Chad said, the Kirk has been very helpful to me in finishing my master's degree. It's also been my joy to work with the youth of this church for the past year and into the year to come. Chad gave me the opportunity to preach this morning, and I'm grateful to deliver a message to you. I want us to consider a question this morning. When do we give up hope? When do we give up hope? Now, you may be thinking, wait a second, that sounds blasphemous. We don't give up hope. We're the church of Jesus Christ. And you'd be right, and we'll get there. But if we believe we live in a world that doesn't assert this question almost daily, we're not being faithful to the reality of the world we live in. If you don't already know this about me, it won't take you long to learn that I'm a huge sports fan. I know it's been a few weeks now, but recently LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers faced the Golden State Warriors in the NBA Finals. Now, I happen to be a big fan of LeBron, and I've seen him pull off some incredible athletic feats. This year's path to his 8th straight championship contest being no exception. So I geared up for Game 1. They lost. I didn't want to give up. I was excited for Game 2, which they lost. But I didn't want to give up hope yet. They'd just gone down 0-2 in Boston and pulled it out. They'd been down 0-2 in 2016. So, hopefully, I watched Game 3, which they lost. Now, no team in NBA history has ever come back from an 0-3 deficit, and of course, they went on to lose Game 4. I think when they went down 0-3, that's about when I gave up hope. And maybe when you're down 0-3 in the NBA Finals, that's the time to stop hoping. Well, in our first scripture reading this morning, we hear of Paul's desire to come face to face with the Thessalonian church so that he might supply what is lacking in their faith. Well, this should strike us as rather strange. The Thessalonian church is one of the most praised churches in any of Paul's letters. Elsewhere, we read strict admonishments like, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" But not so here. Paul's affectionate towards the Thessalonians and proud of their faith, calling the church his glory and joy. The faith of the church, Paul says, has become an example to all believers in Macedonia and in Achaia. Their reputation for faith precedes them. Now, not everyone has it as bad as those foolish Galatians, but the Thessalonians receive as much praise from Paul as anyone. So what in the world is lacking in their faith? Well, Jennifer and I spent a few weeks together studying 1 Thessalonians, and we were in the middle of our Bible study one evening when we heard a crash, and we turned at the sound. Now, in our dining area, we have these framed graphics of faith, hope, and love hanging on the wall. And there, in the middle of our Bible study, hope had fallen. Jennifer looked at me, she looked at the fallen hope, and she said, "That's it. That's the missing elements of the Thessalonians' faith." Okay, that's not exactly how it happened. Although, this is mostly a true story. We were studying the book, and hope did fall while we were in the midst of our study. And Jennifer did comment to me that it was a little ironic, because despite the Thessalonians' excellent qualities of faith and love, their hope was lacking. Now, I admit this was a nice coincidence, but waiting for your decorations to break is not the most faithful way to do biblical exegesis. But there are plenty of clues in the text that tell us the Thessalonians were missing hope, and that's what Paul wanted to supply for them. We probably know the famous trio of faith, hope, and love from 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter, where Paul writes, "So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love." Well, earlier in 1 Thessalonians, in chapter 1, right at the beginning, Paul changes the sequencing of these virtues to place the emphasis on hope rather than love. He writes, "We remember before our God and Father your work of faith and labor of love and steadfastness of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ." We heard in our first reading today that Paul is grateful for a report of faith and love, but there's no mention of hope. For this church in this time, the message of hope is most important. The last half of the letter is all about the hope of the resurrection because the Thessalonians simply didn't understand it. Hope was a message the Thessalonians needed to hear, despite excelling in faith and love. And it's a message we need to hear today as we are confronted daily by the question, when do we give up hope? Well, we've heard about some of these themes in recent weeks. Chad preached about the latest celebrity suicides. These high-profile tragedies remind us of the need for hope. Kathy, Jennifer, and I attended an 8-hour suicide prevention training course last fall, and the course identified just 2 root causes of suicide. One is a loss of social connection, and the other is a loss of hope. I see things on the internet. We all do, right? Or the news. It's frustrating. Just recently I got one of those antennas so you can get a handful of free channels. It's the first time I've had live television in my home since 2014. But I had to buy it to watch the NBA Finals, of course. But now I watch the news sometimes, and well, it's depressing. Even worse, I see things on Facebook. For example, about the recent celebrity suicides. One post I saw showed this picture of graves. It was rows and rows of tombstones. And the caption said, "The recent celebrity suicide gets so many likes and shares, but no one's talking about the hundreds of suicides by military veterans that continue happening." Well, this frustrates me immensely. It frustrates me on the one hand because it fails to acknowledge the reality of evil and the tragedy of a suicide, even if it's a celebrity. It frustrates me because it uses those veteran suicides as an argument for a point, instead of acknowledging the reality that hundreds of veterans concluded they had no more hope. You see, when we engage in debate over which tragedy is worse, instead of doing what we can as the church to heal the desperate wounds of the world, we must ask ourselves if we have given up hope too. Well, in that same love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, Paul writes that if we speak in tongues like angels, or if we have all prophetic powers, or understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and have faith to move mountains, but we don't have love, we are nothing. Indeed, he says, without love, we are a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Well, so often in rooms that exist only in cyberspace, we are noisy gongs and clanging cymbals, or noisy fingers clicking on a keyboard or on our phones, posting and sharing and arguing over tragedies without love. Have we given up hope? I could go on naming the harsh realities of the world, which demand of us every day to consider the question, when do we give up hope? For a year and a half, I've worked as an instructional aide at an alternative school for at-risk youth, and in August, I'll begin teaching there. In that school, stories of drug abuse, delinquency, trauma, and broken families are real, they're prevalent, and powerful. I completed my master's degree by conducting an independent research study on the question, how do we engage in faithful ministry with at-risk youth? And through this process of research and spiritual discernment, I discovered a number of insights about the gospel response to at-risk youth. And perhaps the most powerful was the idea that we can choose hope amid despair. We can choose to envision and live out alternative narratives of hope despite the realities of evil. The power to enact real change is awesome. If Paul found it necessary to give a message of hope to the Thessalonians, who were otherwise overflowing with faith and love, how much more do we need that message today? And Paul delivered that message. I mentioned that the last half of the letter is about the resurrection. Now, most scholars believe 1 Thessalonians was the first New Testament book written before even the Gospels, when the church spread the good news through the powerful oral tradition of the time. The Thessalonian church simply did not know what came next. They had known and believed that Jesus was Lord. They absorbed his message of love, and they loved one another well. But as to the future things, as to those Christians who had died, they were simply uninformed. So Paul teaches them. He writes this: "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that is, those who have died, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven, and we will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord." That's the message of hope. Well, let me tell you another basketball story. In the 2016 NBA Finals, LeBron James and the Cleveland Cavaliers faced a 3-1 deficit against the reigning champion Golden State Warriors. Now, no team has ever come back from 0-3 in any playoff series, but no team had ever come back from 3-1 in the championship series. Now, the Cavs had to win the last 3 games in a row. 2 of them were on the road. I think you probably know where I'm going with this. They did it. Behind incredible, legacy-defining performances, they brought Cleveland its first championship in 52 years. Well, the answer to our question just might be never. We should never give up hope. Well, of course, sometimes sports turn out one way and sometimes they turn out another, and I recognize the difference. You may say, well, 3-1, I can pull off a legacy-defining performance to overcome the 3-1 deficit in my life, but 0-3, that's impossible. And when we look around at the world, sometimes it feels impossible. But in this instance, we can choose which narrative will guide our lives. We can choose the alternative narrative of hope and enact positive change in the world. You see, we are a narrative people, a story people. It's why we love a good suspense film or a romance novel or the thrill of sports stories spun a dozen different ways. It's why the God of the universe chooses to reveal himself in a book that is not only narrative, but which contains narratives throughout, and is itself ultimately the narrative of God's redemptive mission in the world. And while sports are diversionary and fleeting, the story of hope in Jesus Christ is eternally true. That is the story we can choose to live amid tragedies. Well, if we've received this message of hope, let's do something with it. Paul doesn't share the message for its own sake. He encourages the church not to grieve as those who don't have hope. Likewise, we don't have to live as those who don't have hope. In our second reading today, Paul gives the church some very practical advice. He commends them again for their love. He encourages them to love more and more. And then he suggests to the Thessalonians that they aspire to live quietly, to mind their own affairs, and to work with their hands, so they may walk properly before outsiders and be dependent on no one. Well, in that time and in that place, that advice was how the Thessalonians could be godly people. We might require some guidance in reading the Bible to see what we might do to be godly people and to live out this message of hope in this time and in this place, perhaps in ways that are quiet or in ways that are incredibly loud. Now, I'm not suggesting some kind of magic hermeneutical tool. I'm simply suggesting that we read the text thoroughly and honestly. There's no universal prescription for something this big. Paul drops a bombshell of theological truth that the day of the Lord is coming and we will be caught up in the clouds and be with the Lord forever. But if I'm the baker or the miller or the lawyer or the doctor, I don't leave my work behind and wait for the end of the world. Rather, I strive to do what is appropriate in my context to be godly. And I do so with the confidence, with the hope that I am part of the larger story where the God who is love reigns. Now, Christians have disagreed about how to interpret the Bible. We know this, right? A common issue is a failure or a refusal to acknowledge what the Bible is. In this case, it's a letter to a church. The words of hope in the coming of the Lord are words about the nature of the universe, about what is to come, and they are eternally true. The advice to live quietly and mind one's own affairs are words to a church in a context that is not the same as ours. The hope applies to us. It should define us. The advice guides us, but it should not limit our responses to evil. You see, the narrative of God's redemptive mission in the world is one in which all stories, all evils and tragedies are turned to good purpose, where all things, even creation itself, are made new, and where all people are invited into an eternity of love. You are part of that story. The way you live it out is unlimited. It is yet to be. If you turn to God, He will guide you, that you may confront evil in the world and love may abound more and more. Remember it when hope falls from your walls and shatters on the ground. Let it be a reminder of things to come when hope falls from the sky and we are caught up in the clouds to be with the Lord. Until that day, take part in God's story of redemption, which does not suffer evil, but works in faith, labors in love, and is steadfast in hope.